Hi, everybody. Thank you guys for joining. Super excited you're here. I'm Jackie Hertz. I'm the Director of Alliances and Private Equity here at Zone. I'll be the host today for this webinar. I'm really excited for the session we have planned, and we all definitely hope you walk away with some valuable insights. For those who might not be familiar with Zone, we are a software company focused on helping businesses streamline and automate finance and accounting operations. And RSM, our partner, is a leading global network that offers audit, tax, and consulting services. Zone and RSM have been partners for years. We've built a very strong partnership, helping our clients maximize the value of NetSuite. So we're especially excited to be able to team up on this webinar and offer some thought leadership and guidance around KPIs for PE-backed companies. We'll kind of cover the critical role of the systems behind, as well as processes. Chad, I will hand it over to you to kick it off.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jackie, and good afternoon, everybody. Just by way of introduction, my name is Chad Wonderling. I'm the CFO here at Zone. I've been with Zone for it'll be 13 months tomorrow, so a little over a year. Definitely more than a year's worth of work within 13 months, but it's been great. But prior to Zone, I actually spent nearly 4 years as a customer. So a lot of what I share with you today will be from the perspective of not only the CFO seat, from the view of being private equity backed, which we are here at Zone, and the uniqueness of that, which I'll talk about here in a minute, but also from the view of a customer and having been through this experience that we will share with you today around metrics and lead to cash. But Jackie, we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Awesome. So I think first is, this webinar is obviously intended KPIs for PE-backed companies. That's the title of it. And the reason why I want to pause here for just a second and recognize something very unique from that of a CFO seat in combination with being at a PE-backed company is a couple things. One is, as a CFO, there's a few kind of foundational things that are critical for company performance, and that is expected of us in the PE environment as stewards of the investment. And those things are, one is, we are the foundational setter for the operations of the company. We are the builder and the owner of the growth infrastructure, which we'll talk a bit more about in more detail and what that means. So the growth infrastructure, which requires scalability. And then thirdly, and very importantly, is we are the performance leader and driver within the business from the seat of CFO. And that is expected of us in the PE environment. And I will also say this is that, look, I know that there's a large demand for CFOs out there, particularly in the PE environment, but it's really interesting. And why that is a big difference and why that's, being a PE-backed CFO versus, any other type of CFO is, for example, being a public company CFO, the mindset and the thought might be, I need to set and beat X target within the next short period of time. Compare that to the PE-backed CFO, which is, I need to realize X value in Y time. Or another group will figure it out. And I only say that because timing is such a real element in the PE space. Timing is real. And then also take those three foundational things that I mentioned before as performance leader, foundational setter, and the builder and owner of the growth infrastructure, is we are the drivers of the value creation. Okay. Now, take that to these three circles right here is, I think about our role as CFO is we've got to be masters of the business model. We've got to know the investment thesis. Okay. And that obviously comes from and is driven from the PE firm and from their sponsorship. And then we've got to form KPIs and our metrics around those two things, which then brings us to our discussion today around the metrics. And I think what's critical about the metrics is the first thing as we think about what are the metrics to drive the business, how do we get there, is the metrics are very dependent and can change based upon the stage of the company. But we set those around while being mindful of the investment thesis and our business model. So I think as we dive into and begin to consider kind of from the seat of the CFO, the metrics and the KPIs, there's no better way to really kind of do that through consideration of what we like to call in the SaaS space, the rule of 40, or sometimes referred to as the rule of X, which is a very simple way for companies, operators, say like myself or like many of you here, to evaluate our operating metrics in a very simplified way. So let's just pause for a second and kind of walk through this together. So kind of rule of 40 or rule of X is the combination of two things. One, our annualized growth or year over year growth in revenue, okay, plus our operating margin as a percent of revenue, or what we can also call free cash flow as a percent of revenue. Rule is that in popularized, I think I want to say in like 15, 16 by a couple venture investors, is that should always sum to 40. Some will argue, some investors will argue, maybe it should be something greater than 40 or whatever. That's why it's sometimes referred to as rule of X. And if we unpack that, okay, if we unpack that, and if we think about our role from the seat of the CFO, is there's a number of key metrics that go into what I'll kind of refer to as the rule of X output. I think as we think about revenue growth, and again, very dependent upon stage, but here at Zone, the way we see it and the way we measure it and think about it and talk about it at the ELT level and throughout the company is net new ARR. So what is our bookings, less our churn. And then also, a key metric in driving growth and even to a degree measuring some efficiency is what we have down on the left around net dollar retention. So in the software space, that is if you had $1 coming into the year, what is that worth today? What is that $1 worth today? That's an indication of our ability to retain and sell more products into our customers. And then the other one is gross retention, gross revenue retention, gross dollar retention. Very similar is our ability to retain customers. So we started with $1. What is left of that same $1 today versus what it's worth in NDR? And then I think the other component here around operating margin is, look, I had once recently heard it referred to as, kind of the COVID, immediately post-COVID era with very low interest rates or 0% interest rates, referred to as the ZIRP period, where that was a period of growth at all cost. Now, and there has been much more emphasis put on free cash flow, profitability, and operating margin. So, from the role of the CFO, and we've seen it within the last couple of years with all companies, but not just from the CFO seat, is a lot of incremental cost cutting, okay, to try to right size the cost base to get closer to profitability. We all know that can only be done so much. Okay, that is not a sustainable answer. So that's why it comes to, as we think about metrics and what drives the business, it comes down to efficiencies as we think about how we acquire customers, our sales and marketing efficiency, how efficient are our salespeople, what are our conversion rates, okay, and how do we drive those conversion rates? Then ultimately in the seat of finance too, the impact that we play that then leads to free cash flow and how we drive free cash flow. So share all that to say, ultimately, within a business, we can transition, Jackie, to the next slide. I think within a business, kind of the three underlying goals, particularly, in software, but in all businesses, is probably, I think about it in terms of three things, and how I share it with our ELT is we want to be repeatable, we want to be scalable, and we want to be profitable. And from our seat within finance and from the office of the CFO, we know in order to achieve those things, a lot of it is highly dependent upon business performance, market, etc. And so where I've often challenged our team, even our leaders across the ELT, is what can we control? What is within our own control that we can drive efficiencies? And as I think about it, and even having been in my seat and experienced this, there's really no more one common denominator to drive those things than to drive efficiency around cash flow. And that cannot be optimized until we have optimized the quote to cash. And so there's a lot that we can do from our seat of the CFO to drive some of those efficiencies by simply looking within and throughout what I will call, and you'll hear me refer to it today as, we often think about lead to cash, or sometimes in sales it's referred to as lead to conversion and then quote to cash. I think about it, and we think about it here at Zone, as lead to cash, success, and then renewal, as we think about the full cycle revenue and customer experience. So having said all that, given all the dependencies that can exist to drive a cash generating machine within the business, there's a lot of requirements as we set up and optimize our quote to cash process to become hyper efficient around governance and around data and around information. Let me pause there. And I think we do have Paul on. Paul, sir, you can take it from here on governance.
Thanks, Chad. So I'm not sure if the introduction was made, but I'm Paul Morgis. I'm a director in our management consulting practice at RSM, helping technology companies go through lead to cash transformation projects and thinking about the people, process, tech, and data, and the operational processes that underpin them. So over these next few slides, what I'll share is some of my experiences that I've seen around common operational challenges companies face with executing a lead to cash process, how we at RSM think about approving processes, the underlying technology and data, and then summarize with some of the common threads I've seen with companies that have successfully built this out across the enterprise. So to start, I start with some of the challenges, and by no means what you see here is a comprehensive list, but here are some of the common indicators or pain points we see companies facing that are often symptoms of a fragmented or disjointed quote to cash process. Some of the key ones I'll call out, I do commonly see often is really the first is really a lack of alignment or communication between the front office or your sales and your back office in finance. This comes in a few forms, right? Sales team having significant process variation in deal structures, and with these kind of creative new deal structures without the downstream alignment in finance, it really poses challenges for the finance team to really be scalable and drive that automation that we're looking to build as we grow. And you commonly see with this is that finance being the swivel chair and the data transfer between your CRM and ERP for that order entry and really setting up the billing schedules appropriately. Another indicator I commonly see is from the seat of the finance team is really a high volume of cancellations or even billing disputes. Both these are common symptoms of either poor customer experience, whether that's in the onboarding, support, or billing phase, or even just miscommunication, right? A sales rep selling a deal with a set of expectations to the customer, but really not matching to what's being communicated or translated to our downstream teams, whether that's professional services or really billing from the finance seat. So at the end of the day, right, as companies think about scaling, whether that's through like global expansion, new product offerings, operational complexity rises. And without the appropriate governance across the end-to-end process, the more challenging it's going to be to harness the data across the quote to cash process to produce those accurate and actionable KPIs that the CFO wants to see. If we go to the next slide, we wanted to share a few kind of how we think about it at a high level, the process. And I think about it across three dimensions. So the first is really having clear business outcomes defined. As Chad mentioned, right, dependent on the investment thesis of the private equity group or the CFO, it's going to be in one of these buckets around top line growth, retention, building a foundation to consolidate acquisitions, or cost optimization, or all of them. And so we really want to first start with aligning on that and ensuring we have the right KPIs to drive the business outcomes. The second on the bottom left there is kind of a pictorial view of cross-functional alignment. Lead to cash touches every function of the organization. And so to do it right, it really starts with translating the organization's strategy and how the business wants to operate, and then building the end-to-end process across these different teams that have clear handoffs, procedures across, and a cohesive end-to-end journey. And then last is designing the process through experience, right? I think at the end of the day, we want to improve the customer, the partner, or even the employee journey And for lead to cash, it's really like, if you think about it, it's really linking those front office opportunities, contracts and subscriptions and renewals, driving those automated renewals, but then having the right processes and infrastructure in place to automate and hand off to those downstream teams. So that can be your professional services, support, provisioning, and invoicing. And when done right and pieced together, this really optimizes the customer's engagement with the organization. So if we jump to the next one here, so now, as we think about it, we have business strategy, the KPIs, we have a go-forward process. And now it's critical to ensure you have a scalable tech stack to support that. As you see on the page here is an example of a leading practice tech stack across lead to cash. But ultimately, this is an illustrative view and ultimately might vary based on your needs and requirements as an organization. But generally thinking, we want to be selecting the software that can support your business requirements, making sure that it's enterprise ready to handle future requirements that you might have as you grow and scale. And then lastly, along with the applications you see across each of the functional areas, it's almost equally important to have a clear data and integration strategy, which is typically supported by a middleware platform that can connect the data across these various platforms. We jump to the next slide here, and staying on the topic of data, I've been through many of these lead to cash transformation optimizations, and at the end of the day, data is the foundation. At the top of the pyramid, as you see here, the CFOs want to get that consistent, accurate reporting packages to make informed decisions. We've aligned the KPIs to make sure we're reporting and looking at the right things to drive action across the organization. But where companies really struggle, and sometimes it's kind of obvious, is the actual underlying data and the data governance that supports those KPIs and reporting packages. I work a lot in the tech industry specifically, and I think about it in three different buckets for my clients. The first is around establishing appropriate data governance protocols. This is really focusing on your master data, having a single source of truth for customers and products. And once you have that, you can then sync that across your ecosystem. The second, and I think it's probably the most important, is your contract and subscription database. This is where you're really going to do all your ARR reporting, but how you make this accurate is having business process rules and system validations to ensure that we produce a clean and accurate contract and subscription records to understand what the customer has entitlements to. And last one where I spend a fair bit of time with my clients is around the chart of accounts. It's enabling segments and dimensionality that a lot of these systems have to simplify, but also meet those management reporting requirements. If you stitch those three core things together, for me, that's the underlying, I call it reporting cockpit, and then you can really stitch together a lot of the other pieces around it. To jump down to the next page here, to close the kind of operational process pillars out, I wanted to leave it with what are the things that I see organizations with successful quote to cash processes having. And I think about it in like these 6 big pillars. The first is having clear executive alignment on the strategy. This is getting together the CFO, the CRO, your chief customer officer, and really aligning on how do we want to go to market, how do we want to do business, and getting all aligned at the executive level. Once you have that, you then start defining what are the customer pathways we want to bring our customers through. This can be your direct sales motions, your e-commerce, your partner motions, but having a clear view of how do you want to bring the customer end to end. And once you have that process defined, then you support it with the data and tech. So we want to have an integrated application architecture. When you have systems that are not integrated together, disconnected, it does lead to a lot of, obviously manual data transfer, but also disconnected data and systems, and how you stitch together produces inaccurate KPIs. The fourth one is data governance. I'm hammering the data piece a little bit on this too, because it's just one of those fundamental things that you want to make sure you get right. You have all the right tech in the world, the right process, but if you don't have data, we're not going to be able to produce the KPIs you need to get. Adoption of process automation is important. A lot of these tech systems that you saw on the previous page are designed to be best practice. So how can we leverage out of the box where we can to build that scalable model and customize where we think it's appropriate, and really trying to focus those customizations on improving the experience of our customers. And last one, which I find more often than not, is just documentation, right? What are the decisions that we've actually made? How do we want to ensure that those get solidified and really brought through, whether that's training and building the procedures of our functional teams, but also ensuring that whatever we build in our systems, we're not 1 week later turning around and changing the whole thing. And there's a little pictorial view on the right-hand side, just giving you kind of a snapshot of just like as simple as documenting where you master data is important, right? As we think about our leading practice between a CRM and ERP, we want customers to be mastered in your CRM system and sync down to the ERP for billing. I've seen product in your product catalog in both systems. I've seen it in CRM and ERP, but you want to define one as your master and sync it between the systems. Contracts and subscriptions are typically sourced in your contracting engine and pushed down into billing. And then invoices, right? Invoices mastered in your billing system and syncing that back up to Salesforce so your sales reps can see the outstanding balances of your accounts. As simple as that is, and that model is just tremendously important as you think about data, documentation, and governance.
That's great, Paul. And I'd say just flip back just real quick. One, that's great. I would say, even connecting this back to metrics, a couple of things while Paul is hitting data. I'm going to hit two other things, and they relate to data. One is we go back to executive alignment on strategy, but let's also be explicit about executive alignment on strategy and metrics. Like, what are those metrics that the ELT is looking at on a periodic basis? Because if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so I think that's critical too, executive alignment on metrics. And then also too is the alignment and the importance of data at the ELT level in terms of the alignment. Because as we can tell, and as we're trying to kind of depict here, is like so much of this impacts sales, it impacts marketing. I have conversations with our chief marketing officer and chief revenue officer nearly every day about this topic in a good way, because we've all got to be all over it. And then I think from the seat of the CFO, it's one of these things where, particularly with data is a great example, but in this context is ask yourself, if nobody owns it, my rule of thumb that I've learned is the CFO owns it. So Paul spoke a little bit about and shared a little bit about, those successful implementations, what they've been like or what they've looked like, or some of the commonalities. And I think I shared at the outset that I was a customer of Zone for nearly 3-4 years before joining in my current capacity. And we went through a big, almost like a re-architect in a real optimization of our entire quote to cash process. Okay, because we knew within our finance team that we wanted our quote to cash in a prior life, prior to Zone, of course. We wanted that, but even still here at Zone, we want that to be a competitive advantage for us. So just some examples as we went through and re-architected and optimized our quote to cash process. Obviously, we worked very closely cross-functionally with revenue operations, all of our Salesforce administrators, sales team, marketing team, et cetera. But the investment that we put in and what we realized by reducing our DSO from 60 days down to 48 days, that's real cash. That was absolute real cash. And then the other thing too is the thing that I feel like is often underrated that we experienced in our past was as we re-architected and optimized our quote to cash process, that actually improved, oddly enough, the customer experience with respect to they understood their invoice. They understood what they were being charged for. And then what we're able to do is, while reducing customer invoicing questions by 85%, we're able to basically unleash some of that resource back within the business to drive more value from a finance side. And then the other thing that we did that we realized, often, I referred to DSO, but often, what is not considered within DSO is, are you actually invoicing on a timely basis? And so what we're able to do is over 98% of our invoices were invoiced on the subscription start date, which was a significant improvement from where we used to be. We reduced invoice preparation time as we developed more automation. And of course, it all started, that automation was only successful through clean data. We reduced our invoice preparation time by over 80%. And then interestingly enough, there was one question in the poll, something about gap forecasting, is what we were able to do through clean data, through re-architecting and optimizing our quote to cash process, is that resulted in such clean data and almost like at the subscription line level for what we were charging to our customers, that we used data from our zone billing product to forecast future gap revenue. So the level of accuracy with our financial forecast, it increased. That allowed us to make better, more informed decisions. So those are just some experience points. But Jackie, we can transition off to the next one. And so while that definitely impacted cash flow, how we thought about the business on a marginal basis, but on a real basis, there was also a level of efficiency that we experienced as well. And I think what we were able to do is we kind of took this concept of quote to cash, we broadened it out because it is so holistic and it involves so many different functions as we thought about it in terms of lead to cash. And then also how we thought about renewals from the process, how we thought about upgrades, and what we were able to do because we had clean data, because we had the system and the automation to handle the upgrades, the upsells on our particular contracts that then led to, of course, accurate invoices, but also an element of flexibility, okay, and also scalability from an operational standpoint. Very good. Next one, Jackie. So, Paul, I can kind of kick off here and then you can jump back in terms of BI. I think the thing that is very critical more broadly with respect to just lead to cash and that process, but really just around metrics is, simplify. And from my seat as the CFO, being in a software organization is the slightest kind of impact and improvement within the metrics that we measure can have a big impact in terms of business performance, okay? And how do we do that? By having visibility into those dashboards and those operating metrics that we view on a daily, weekly, and even monthly basis. Paul, anything you want to add here in terms of on a more technical level on BI and reporting?
One thing I will call out, Chad, is a lot of my clients, you hear this coin of customer 360 or really understanding everything tied to the customer. And I think what BI really enables, right, is to have that one view around the customer that we can stitch together data that all of these different functional teams are looking at into a single picture. And I'm in more and more conversations where how do I get to a single customer 360 view that's a single source of truth that everyone in the organization is looking at in the same way? I think the challenges I often see is, for example, sales reporting a different number than finance and all these different reports that come out and people are confused of what's the true number. And I think if you build BI in the right way, have a clear view of who your customers are, and then stitch together the transactional data around the customer, I think it really empowers to have a single source of truth around the customer and really can serve them in a much better way.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Because there's a lot of different elements and cuts and in terms of how we can look at the business in terms of segmentation, customer size to make better and more informed decisions. That's great. Next, Jackie. And this is really just an example actually from one of the dashboards that we use here at Zone to kind of run our business from our reporting product. And kind of all that we're just trying to depict here is kind of simplify, and then just clear alignment on what are those key metrics. Okay. And obviously for me and for us, that revolves around our investment thesis as we think about driving our business. Yeah, so a couple things path forward, and Paul, I'll let you jump in, but I would say from my side, and Paul, I'll let you hammer on data and some reporting is, I think the key thing is define what those key metrics are in your business. Okay, that drive the investment thesis, because it is our job as the CFO from the office of the CFO to drive performance within the business, getting alignment on those KPIs, because we cannot improve what we don't measure. And then I think the other component of it is like from our seat is in the role that we play is in order for the business to be repeatable, scalable, and profitable. That cannot happen in the most optimal way with a suboptimal lead to cash process. Paul, you can take the others.
Yeah, no, I mean, you hit on the head, Chad, there. And I think to make that optimal process, right, you need the inputs to the system to produce the output that you're looking to get, right? So I just, to hammer the point home in a sense, data is the foundation, put that through the processes and the reporting tools you have, and then you start getting accurate reporting and KPIs to really drive the business decision making.
That's great. Folks, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.
Chad, it looks like we did get one question. I think it was more along the lines on the contract side, but wanted to know in terms of what type of tools do you guys work with in terms of helping support contract changes?
Yeah, so probably a few different elements of that, but I think so let me first speak from that of a, because what I'm hearing the question is around like amendments to contracts, and that can be the amendment process and what that means within the, say, amend to cash process and amend to invoice process can be a big nightmare. And I think what's interesting is, and this is me speaking from that of a customer and a prior user, particularly of the Zone Billing product, is that was the benefit. One of the quick benefits that we realized, I didn't mention it in some of those things that we had realized when we had made that investment, is the way that the Zone Billing product is set up is it is able to handle and is flexible enough through the subscription records to handle contract amendments. Okay, which is unlike many of the other products out there that allows and permits for more flexibility, that makes it a lot easier.
Thanks, Chad. And I think we might have another one. Elliot, can you see the chat, the Q&A chat?
I can, yeah. Someone has posted that, Chad, you mentioned that you had used the data from Zone Billing and other operational reporting. I think the question is around, more specifically, around the tooling and the how you reported on that NetSuite native data that is extended and enhanced with the Zone Billing product. Can you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, so I can tell you how we did it. I could tell you how we are doing it now at Zone, which are two different things. So, and then Elliot, you can guide me too if I need to go deeper. But the way that we had previously handled kind of revenue by customer and kind of GAAP revenue to be recognized, kind of a waterfall over time, is it was basically just a simple data download, basically out of NetSuite through the Zone Billing product. So it was like nothing pretty. Some saved searches were created. It wasn't very pretty whatsoever. However, now one thing that we're using here at Zone to help us is our Solution 7 product, connecting that into NetSuite, obviously, and which it is natively is connected, and then through the zone billing products, then we can have it in Excel through an automatic connection rather than some safe searches that then create a lot of data manipulation. So it's through the Solution 7 product that we're doing it now today in terms of forecasting all of our GAAP revenue with the contracts that we do have on the books.
That's great. Paul, wondering if you have anything that you want to add on kind of the reporting front?
Yeah, I know Zone has a lot of great capabilities within the tool, and I'm not sure if everyone on the call has a Zone billing tool set, but I've seen other tools that like a BI or your FP&A automation tools that can support some of that financial forecasting capabilities that with the right data structure and connections can sync your NetSuite data and Zone billing data to provide some of that financial forecasting capabilities as well.
Awesome. I think we have one, I'm able to see, I think we have one last question, at least in the chat. In terms of, industries, any specific guidance relevant to certain industries, or is this kind of more, industry agnostic as you talk about, governance, best practices, and system stacks?
I'll let Paul chime in too, but I think in terms of like best practices, data governance, I mean, that is definitely industry agnostic. And I only say that because I've lived outside of the software industry, and that's true. That's true no matter. But Paul, I'll let you answer on tech stack and kind of what you've seen. And I know you're primarily tech, but you can shed some light on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the end, like an enterprise process, irrespective of the tech stack, can change between what you're in, right? So tech, SaaS, primarily, if you start going into like industrial products or CP, completely different motion. But generally speaking, what I've seen in the market is these tools are becoming more industry specific and providing the kind of needs and requirements that are specific to the industry. So as you think about like in my specialties around tech is the typical tech stack of your Salesforce and CPQ and integrating with a zone billing product and an ERP. These tools are designed to support the business model. And so when I think about, best practice with tech, it's, we want to get to a point of we're automating renewals. We're standardizing how we co-term contracts. We have an effective process of how we do amendments, and all that pushes down to billing for accurate billing, but also, we have the right tools in our ERP to calculate rev rec appropriately with the 606 guidance. So I think there's definitely different tech stacks, I think, that align with specific industries, but ultimately at the end of the day, you want full alignment across your enterprise process, across the different functions, and then the tech to support it may vary across what industry you're in.
Great. Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Really appreciate you guys being here, and hope everybody has a good rest of the day.